Augusto 1945, Japan was still standing, but only just. Cities were alive in their own quiet way. Children still laughed in the streets. Families still sat together, sharing simple meals. Life had become harder, but it had not stopped. People believed, somehow, tomorrow would still come. But high above the sky, something was already on its way. A decision had been made far away, and no one in Japan knew what was coming toward them. There were no alarms, no warnings, no time to prepare. Only a clear blue sky, calm, silent, almost peaceful. And then, in a single moment, the light would appear, brighter than anything the human eye had ever seen. And in that instant, an entire city would vanish. Lives would be erased. Time itself would feel like it had stopped. But this is not only a story of that moment. This is a story of what came before it, and what rose after it. A story of pain, survival, and a strength the world would never forget. Before we begin, tell me something. From which country are you watching this video? And what time is it right now in your city? Before the bomb, a nation still standing. Japan, in the final summer of 1945, was a nation carrying the weight of years that had slowly taken everything from it. Yet even under that heavy burden, life refused to completely disappear. And that is what makes this moment so powerful. Because even when history is about to change forever, ordinary people are still living ordinary lives, unaware that they are standing at the edge of something they cannot even imagine. The war had already reached deep into every corner of the country, not just on battlefields far away, but inside homes, inside hearts, inside the daily rhythm of survival that had become normal for millions of people, where food was no longer something you chose, but something you hoped to find, where families learned to live with less, speak less, and expect less. And yet, even in that difficult reality, there was still a quiet determination that refused to break. In Hiroshima, the city stood with a strange kind of calm that only exists when people have already seen hardship and learned how to live with it. Because while other cities had been heavily bombed in previous months, Hiroshima had been spared the worst of it. And because of that, many believed that perhaps their city would somehow be safe, or at least not completely destroyed like others had been, and that small belief became a silent comfort that no one questioned too deeply. The streets of Hiroshima still moved with life in a way that almost felt normal, even though nothing was truly normal anymore, because men still walked to work carrying their responsibilities on tired shoulders, women still managed their homes with quiet strength, and children still went to school, holding on to routines that gave them a sense of stability in a world that had become uncertain. And when you look at it closely, you realize that routine is one of the strongest forms of hope, because it allows people to believe that tomorrow will come just like today. On that morning, the sky above Hiroshima was clear, in a way that felt almost too perfect, a wide-open blue that stretched endlessly without a single cloud to interrupt it. And there was something peaceful about that sky, something that made the city feel safe for just a little while longer, because no one looks at a calm sky and expects it to bring destruction, and that is what made this moment so quietly dangerous. People woke up slowly as the morning light filled their homes, and like every other day, they began to move through their routines without thinking about history or war or anything beyond the next few hours, because survival had taught them to focus on the present, on small tasks, on simple actions that kept life moving forward even when everything else felt uncertain. A father might have been reading a newspaper, trying to understand a world that no longer made sense, while a mother prepared a modest breakfast, carefully using whatever little food was available, stretching every ingredient as far as possible, because waste was no longer an option. And nearby, A child might have been getting ready for school, adjusting their uniform, unaware that this morning was not like any other morning. Shops opened their doors as they always did, even if there was not much to sell, because opening the shop was not just about business, it was about normality, about sending a message to the world and to themselves that life had not ended yet. And in those small acts of continuation, you can see the quiet courage of people who refuse to give up, even when everything around them suggested that they should. Bicycles moved along the streets, carrying workers, students, and messages from one part of the city to another, and trains followed their tracks with the same discipline they always had. Because systems were still functioning, society was still holding together, and from the outside, Hiroshima did not look like a city standing just moments away from destruction. There was fear in the air, but it was not loud or overwhelming. It was quiet, controlled, pushed into the background so that people could continue living, because constant fear is something the human heart cannot carry forever. So it learns to hide it, to soften it, to replace it with routine and small moments of peace. And that is exactly what was happening in Hiroshima on that morning. What makes this moment so powerful is not just what happened next, but how normal everything felt right before it happened. Because history does not always announce itself with warning signs. Sometimes it arrives silently, quietly, hidden behind an ordinary morning that looks just like every other morning. And that is why no one in Hiroshima truly understood how close they were to a moment that would change not only their lives, but the entire world. And while the city moved forward in that calm, unaware rhythm, far away from Hiroshima, something was already in motion, something that had been planned, built, and decided by people who would never stand in the streets. They were about to change forever, because above the ocean, beyond the reach of those living their normal lives, a plane was moving steadily through the sky, carrying with it a weapon that had never been used before, a weapon that would not just destroy buildings, but redefine what destruction meant. Inside that plane, everything was controlled, calculated, precise, because for those involved, this was not a moment of confusion. It was a mission, a decision already made, a path already chosen. And as the aircraft continued its journey toward Japan, the distance between peace and devastation grew smaller with every passing second. Back in Hiroshima, the morning continued exactly as it had begun. Calm, steady, almost peaceful. And that is what makes the next moment so impossible to fully understand, because when everything feels normal, when life feels like it will continue, when people are simply living their lives without fear of immediate danger, that is often when history changes the fastest. And in that quiet, ordinary morning, with the sky still clear and the city still alive, no one could see what was coming closer. No one could feel the invisible line between before and after, because that line had not yet been crossed. But it was only seconds away. The moment everything changed. But it was only seconds away. And in those final seconds, the city of Hiroshima continued to breathe, as if nothing in the world could interrupt its quiet rhythm. Because the people walking its streets, sitting inside its homes, and moving through their morning routines had no reason to believe that history was about to break through their lives with a force no human being had ever experienced before. And that is what makes this moment so powerful, because everything felt stable at the exact moment it was about to be shattered beyond recognition. High above the city, far beyond what any human eye could see, the aircraft moved steadily through the sky, carrying within it a weapon that did not look extraordinary from the outside, yet inside it held a level of power that would change the definition of destruction forever. And as the plane reached its position, the distance between decision and consequence disappeared completely, because what had been planned for months was now about to unfold in a single instant. At exactly 8:15 the morning, the bomb was released. It began to fall silently, without sound, without warning, cutting through the clear blue sky that had moments ago felt so peaceful. And for those on the ground, there was nothing to notice yet. No signal, no sign, just another ordinary second in a normal morning that was about to become the last normal second for thousands of people. As the bomb descended, time continued moving forward in Hiroshima, unaware that it was about to be divided into two parts, a before that would never return, and an after that would never be forgotten, because in that brief fall, in those silent seconds between sky and earth, history itself seemed to hold its breath. Then it happened. A flash of light erupted above the city, so intense, so overwhelming, that it erased shadows and replaced them with pure brightness. A brightness that human eyes were never meant to witness, and for a fraction of a moment, everything in Hiroshima was illuminated in a way that felt almost unreal, as if the world had turned into light itself before collapsing into something far darker. The heat came instantly after the flash, moving faster than anything people could react to, a wave of energy so powerful that it burned through skin, through clothing, through anything in its path, leaving behind a level of destruction that no one had ever imagined possible, because this was not just heat. It was something far beyond ordinary fire, something that carried the force of an entirely new kind of weapon. Buildings that had stood for years, homes that had held families, schools that had carried the voices of children, all of it began to break apart in seconds as the shockwave spread outward with unstoppable force, smashing windows, tearing walls apart, and turning solid structures into fragments that were thrown across the city like pieces of paper caught in a storm. People who had been walking in the streets vanished in the center of the explosion, their lives ending before their minds could even understand what was happening, while those farther away were thrown violently to the ground, their bodies struck by the force of something they could not see or comprehend. And in those moments, confusion and fear replaced the calm that had filled the city just seconds before. The sound came after the light and the heat, a deep, overwhelming roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing through what remained of the city. And for those who could still hear, it was a sound that would stay with them forever, because it was not just an explosion, it was the sound of an entire world collapsing in a single moment. Fires began to rise across Hiroshima, not as small, separate flames, but as a growing sea of fire that spread rapidly through the broken city, feeding on the remains of buildings, wood, paper, and anything that could burn. And as those fires grew, the air itself became harder to breathe, filled with smoke, dust, and heat that made survival even more difficult for those who were still alive. Above it all, a massive cloud began to form, rising high into the sky, carrying with it the dust and destruction of the city below, growing larger and darker as it climbed, becoming a symbol of something the world had never seen before, something that would later be recognized everywhere as a sign of the power that had just been unleashed. And beneath that cloud, Hiroshima was no longer the city it had been just moments earlier, because the streets that had once been full of life were now filled with silence, broken only by distant cries, collapsing structures, and the sound of fire consuming what remained. And in that silence, there was a feeling that words could not fully capture, a sense that something far greater than destruction had taken place. For those who survived the first seconds, the reality of what had happened did not come all at once, because the human mind cannot easily understand something so sudden, so complete, and so overwhelming. So instead, people began to move, to look around, to try to understand where they were and what had happened to the world they had known just moments before. Some called out for their families, their voices weak but desperate, hoping that someone would answer, while others tried to stand, to find their way through the ruins, even as pain and confusion made every movement difficult. because survival is something that continues even in the most impossible situations, even when the world itself seems to have ended. The sky that had once been clear was now filled with smoke and darkness, and the sunlight that had gently filled the city earlier was replaced by a strange, heavy atmosphere that made everything feel distant and unreal, as if Hiroshima had been pulled out of the world and placed somewhere else entirely. And yet, even in that moment, even surrounded by destruction, even facing something that no one had ever experienced before, there were people who continued to move forward, step by step, breath by breath, not because they understood what was happening, but because something inside them refused to stop. Because even when everything changes in a single second, life does not end in that same second. And for those who were still alive beneath that darkened sky, their story was no longer about what had happened in that moment. It was about what they would face next, after the blast. The struggle to survive. It was about what they would face next. And what came next was not a moment, not a single event that could be understood quickly, but a slow and painful unfolding of reality, where every second revealed something new, something heavier, something that forced those who survived to face a world that no longer looked or felt like the one they had known just minutes earlier, because the explosion had not only destroyed buildings and streets, it had broken the sense of order that people depended on to understand their lives. In the center of Hiroshima, where life had once moved with quiet purpose, there was now a landscape that felt almost impossible to recognize, because familiar places had been erased, streets had disappeared beneath debris, and the paths people had walked every day were no longer there to guide them, leaving survivors surrounded by a city that had become unfamiliar in an instant, as if they had been placed inside a completely different world. Those who could move began to walk, not with direction, but with instinct, searching for something they could not clearly define, whether it was safety, water, family, or simply a place to sit and understand what had happened. And as they moved through the ruins, they saw things that no human mind is prepared to see, moments of destruction that could not be explained, only experienced. Some people called out names again and again, their voices growing weaker with each attempt, hoping that somewhere in the broken city, someone they loved would answer, while others moved silently, too shocked to speak, their eyes searching through the smoke and dust for anything that felt familiar, anything that could remind them that the world they knew had not completely disappeared. Fires continued to spread across Hiroshima, joining together into larger waves of destruction that moved through the remains of the city, and as those fires grew, they created heat that made it difficult to breathe, turning the air itself into something heavy and dangerous, forcing survivors to cover their faces, to move away, to keep going even when their bodies wanted to stop. The river became a place of desperate movement, as many people, overwhelmed by heat and pain, made their way toward the water, believing it might bring relief. And in those moments, the river that had once been part of daily life became something else entirely, a place where people gathered not for peace, but for survival, seeking even the smallest comfort in a situation where comfort no longer truly existed. Across the city, the silence that followed the explosion was slowly replaced by sounds that carried the weight of what had happened. Distant voices, footsteps moving through debris, structures collapsing further under their own damage, and the constant presence of fire, which did not stop, did not slow, but continued to consume everything in its path, as if the destruction itself was still unfolding. For many, time no longer felt normal, because the difference between minutes and hours became unclear, and the mind, overwhelmed by what it had experienced, struggled to understand how so much could change so quickly, how a normal morning could turn into something so completely different in less than a single moment. And in that confusion, people began to realize that the world they had known before the explosion was gone, replaced by something they did not yet understand. In the distance, the rising cloud remained visible, a dark presence in the sky that seemed to watch over everything below, reminding those who looked at it that what had happened was not a natural disaster, not something that could be explained by ordinary events, but something created, something released, something that had changed the rules of what destruction could be. And yet, even in the middle of that destruction, something else existed, something quieter but just as powerful, because among the ruins, among the fear and confusion, there were small acts of humanity that began to appear, moments where people helped each other stand, shared water, guided one another through the broken city, not because they had the strength to fix what had happened, but because they understood that survival was not something they could face alone. A stranger might support another person who could not walk, moving slowly together through the debris, step by step, while someone else might offer a small amount of water to another, even when resources were almost gone. Because in those moments, the idea of helping someone else became one of the few things that still made sense. One of the few actions that reminded people that even in destruction, they were still human. As the day moved forward, the full reality of the situation became clearer, not all at once, but in pieces, in moments where people realized that entire areas of the city were gone, that places they knew no longer existed, that the number of survivors was far smaller than they could have imagined, and with each realization, the weight of what had happened grew heavier. But even with that weight, even with the pain, the confusion, and the loss that surrounded them, there were those who continued to move, to search, to hope, not because they believed everything would return to normal, but because something inside them refused to give up, something that pushed them forward even when the world around them offered no clear path. Because survival is not always strong or confident, it is often quiet, uncertain, and fragile. But it continues, step by step, even when everything else has stopped. And in Hiroshima, on that day, survival became the only thing that mattered, the only thing that connected those who were still alive in a city that had been changed forever. And as the sun moved across the sky, casting its light over a place that no longer resembled the city it had once been, the story of Hiroshima began to shift, slowly moving from the moment of destruction to the long and difficult journey that would follow, a journey that would not end in a single day, but would continue for years, shaping not only the lives of those who survived, but the future of an entire nation. Because what had happened in those few seconds was only the beginning, and the world that came after it was still unfolding. From ashes to silence, the weight of what remained, and the world that came after it was still unfolding. What followed was not a sudden return to clarity or understanding, but a slow and overwhelming realization that settled over Hiroshima like a heavy shadow, because as the hours passed and the fires continued to burn, the people who had survived began to understand that what they were facing was not something temporary, not something that would pass quickly, but something that had permanently changed their lives, their city, and the meaning of everything they had once known. The day did not feel like a normal day anymore, because time itself seemed to move differently, stretching and bending under the weight of what had happened. And for those walking through the ruins, every step carried both physical effort and emotional confusion as they tried to make sense of a world where familiar places no longer existed and where the idea of before felt distant, even though it had only been hours ago. As survivors continued to move through the destroyed city, they began to see the full scale of what had taken place, not in a single moment, but piece by piece, street by street, as each new area revealed more destruction, more silence, and more absence. And with each discovery, the understanding grew that this was not just damage, It was something far deeper, something that had erased entire parts of the city as if they had never existed. Homes that once held laughter and conversation were now reduced to broken structures or empty spaces. Schools that once echoed with the voices of children stood silent, and the places where people had gathered, worked, and lived their lives had become unrecognizable, leaving behind a landscape that felt less like a city and more like a memory that had been shattered and scattered across the ground. For many survivors, the search for loved ones became the only thing that mattered, because in a world where everything else had been taken away, the hope of finding someone familiar became a powerful force that kept them moving, even when their bodies were exhausted and their minds overwhelmed. And as they called out names, again and again, they carried with them both hope and fear, unsure of what they would find, yet unable to stop searching. The sounds of the city continued to change as the day moved forward, because the initial shock of the explosion had given way to a quieter, heavier atmosphere, where the loud destruction had been replaced by softer, more painful sounds, distant voices calling out, footsteps moving slowly through debris, and the constant presence of fire, which still burned in many places, refusing to fully disappear. As the fires began to slowly lose their intensity in some areas, smoke filled the air, rising into the sky and spreading across what remained of Hiroshima, creating a thick and heavy environment that made it difficult to see clearly. And in that reduced visibility, the city felt even more distant from what it had once been, as if it had been separated from the rest of the world by a barrier of destruction and silence. Water became one of the most important needs, not only because of the heat and exhaustion, but because it represented something basic, something essential, something that connected people to life in a way that had suddenly become uncertain. And as survivors searched for water, whether from rivers, wells, or any source they could find, they were reminded of how quickly the simplest parts of life could become the most difficult to reach. In the midst of all this, the human mind struggled to process what had happened, because there are moments in history that go beyond understanding, moments where the scale of change is so great that it cannot be fully grasped in real time. And for those in Hiroshima, this was one of those moments where reality itself felt unstable, where memory and present experience did not match, and where the idea of normal life felt like something from another world. As the afternoon turned into evening, the light of the sun began to fade, casting long shadows across the ruins, and with that change, a new kind of fear began to appear, because night was coming, and with it, uncertainty, darkness, and the realization that survival would not end with the day, but would continue into a night that no one was prepared for. The absence of electricity meant that darkness would not be pushed back by artificial light, and as the sky slowly dimmed, the city of Hiroshima moved into a night unlike any it had ever experienced, where the usual sounds of life were gone, replaced by a quiet that felt heavy and endless, interrupted only by occasional movement, distant voices, and the soft crackling of fires that still burned in some places. For those who had survived, finding a place to rest became a challenge, because homes were destroyed, shelters were limited, and the environment itself felt uncertain, leaving people to gather wherever they could, often in open spaces, near rivers, or in areas that felt slightly safer than others, even if safety was no longer something that could be clearly defined. The emotional weight of the day began to settle more deeply as night arrived, because with the immediate danger reduced, the mind had more space to reflect, to remember, and to feel the loss that had taken place. And in that reflection, many realized that their lives had been divided into two parts: a before that they could remember but could not return to, and an after that they were only beginning to understand. Yet even in that darkness, even in a night filled with uncertainty and loss, there were still moments of connection, Small acts where people stayed close to one another, shared what little they had, spoke softly, or simply remained together in silence. Because in times of great uncertainty, human presence itself becomes a source of strength, a reminder that even when everything else is lost, the connection between people can still remain. And as that long night continued, the reality of what had happened in Hiroshima began to extend beyond the city itself, because news of the destruction would soon spread, reaching other parts of Japan and eventually the world, carrying with it the understanding that something entirely new had entered history, something that would change not only the course of the war, but the future of humanity, because what had happened was not just the destruction of a city, it was the beginning of a new kind of fear, a new kind of power, and a new kind of future that no one fully understood yet. But even as that larger meaning began to form, for those who were there, for those who had lived through the day and now faced the night, the story was still deeply personal, still about survival, still about finding a way to continue living in a world that had been completely changed. And as the darkness slowly settled over Hiroshima, covering what remained of the city in silence and shadow, one truth became clear. Not through words, but through experience, through the quiet strength of those who remained. The destruction had been immediate, but the consequences were only beginning, the turning point, when a nation faced the end. But the consequences were only beginning. As the night passed over Hiroshima and the first light of a new day slowly began to rise, what remained of the city revealed itself more clearly, not as something that could be fixed quickly or understood easily, but as a reality that would take time, strength, and unimaginable endurance to face, because the destruction of a single day had already reached far beyond the physical boundaries of the city, quietly beginning to shape decisions, emotions, and outcomes that would soon affect the entire nation of Japan. In the early hours following the blast, confusion was not limited to Hiroshima alone, because across Japan there were leaders, officials, and citizens who were trying to understand what had happened, receiving incomplete information, hearing reports that sounded impossible, and struggling to believe that a single weapon could cause such overwhelming destruction in such a short amount of time, because nothing in their experience had prepared them for this kind of event. Communication was slow and uncertain, and in those early moments, even those responsible for making decisions at the highest levels did not fully understand the nature of the weapon that had been used, because what had occurred was not just another bombing, not just another attack in a long war, but something entirely different, something that would force a change not only in military strategy, but in the way war itself was understood. As more details began to emerge, as reports became clearer, as the scale of destruction became impossible to ignore, a realization began to form, slowly at first, then with increasing weight, that the situation had entered a new stage, one where continuing the war would carry consequences that were no longer predictable, no longer limited, and no longer something that could be controlled in the way previous battles had been. Within Japan's leadership, discussions began to intensify, not in calm or certainty, but in tension and uncertainty, because the country stood at a moment where every decision carried enormous weight, where continuing to fight meant risking further destruction, and where surrender meant accepting an outcome that many had tried to avoid for years. And in that space between those choices, the pressure of what had happened in Hiroshima began to influence every conversation. For the people of Japan, far from the rooms where decisions were being made, the reality was simpler and more immediate, because the effects of the war had already reached them in ways that were deeply personal, through loss, through hardship, through the constant presence of uncertainty. And now, with the news of Hiroshima spreading, a new layer of fear began to take shape, one that was not based on past experience, but on the unknown, on the possibility that what had happened once could happen again. And then, before the nation could fully process what had already taken place, another moment arrived that would deepen the impact of the first, because just days later, a second city, Nagasaki, would face a similar fate. And with that second explosion, the reality of the situation became impossible to ignore, because it was no longer a single event, not something that could be explained as an exception, but a pattern, a demonstration of a new kind of power that could be used again. The effect of these events reached deep into the heart of the nation, not only in terms of physical destruction, but in the way people understood the future, because the idea of continuing the war began to feel different, heavier, more uncertain, as the possibility of further devastation became something real rather than theoretical, something that could not simply be dismissed or ignored. At the same time, the voices within Japan that called for a change in direction began to carry more weight, because the situation had shifted in a way that could not be reversed, and the need to consider new options became more urgent, more pressing, as the consequences of delay became clearer with each passing day. For those in positions of leadership, this was not a simple decision, because it involved more than strategy or outcome. It involved identity, honor, and the weight of everything that had come before. And in that sense, the moment was not just about ending a war, but about facing a reality that required a different kind of strength, a strength that comes not from continuing a fight, but from choosing a path that protects what remains. And as these discussions continued, as the pressure increased, as the reality of Hiroshima and Nagasaki settled into the understanding of the nation, a moment approached that would define the direction of Japan's future, because the decision that would soon be made would not only end a conflict, but begin a transformation. When the announcement finally came, it was not delivered as a moment of victory or celebration, but as something quieter, more reflective, carrying with it the weight of everything that had been lost and everything that would need to be rebuilt. And for the people of Japan, hearing those words marked the end of one chapter and the uncertain beginning of another. The war had ended, but the story of Japan was far from over, because ending the war did not erase the destruction that had already taken place. It did not bring back what had been lost, and it did not immediately provide answers to the many questions that remained. Instead, it opened the door to a new reality, one where the focus would shift from conflict to recovery, from survival in war to survival in peace. For the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the end of the war did not bring immediate relief, because their reality was still shaped by what they had experienced, by the loss, the injuries, the memories that would not fade. And for them, the idea of moving forward was not something simple or quick, but something that would take time, patience, and a level of resilience that could not be measured easily. Across the country, people began to face the task of rebuilding, not only physically, but emotionally and socially, because the war had changed more than structures and cities. It had changed the way people saw the world, the way they understood their place in it, and the way they thought about the future. And in that sense, the process of rebuilding would involve more than construction, it would involve transformation. The idea of Japan, as it had existed before the war, was no longer something that could be returned to, because history had moved forward, and with it, the nation would need to find a new path, one that acknowledged the past, while also creating space for something different, something that could grow out of the lessons, the pain, and the experiences that had shaped this moment. And in that space, between what had been lost and what had not yet been built, there was uncertainty, but there was also possibility, because even in the most difficult moments of history, there is always the potential for change, for growth, for the creation of something new that carries forward the strength of those who came before. For Japan, this would become a defining period, not because of the destruction alone, but because of what followed, because of the decisions that were made, the efforts that were taken, and the determination of a people who, even after facing one of the most powerful moments of destruction in history, chose to continue, to rebuild, and to move forward. Because survival is not only about enduring what happens in a single moment, it is about what comes after. And as Japan stood at the edge of that new beginning, shaped by everything that had taken place in Hiroshima and beyond, one truth became clear, not through words, but through the direction of history itself. The end of the war was not the end of the story. It was the start of something new. It was the start of something new. But new beginnings are rarely easy, especially when they rise from moments of deep loss. Because for Japan, the end of the war did not feel like relief at first. It felt like standing in the middle of silence, surrounded by what remained, trying to understand how a nation that had once moved with strength and direction would now find its way forward again after everything had changed so completely. In the months that followed, the reality of rebuilding began to take shape, not as a single effort or a clear plan that could be completed quickly, but as a long and difficult process that would touch every part of life, from the streets and buildings that needed to be restored to the hearts and minds of people who had experienced more than they could easily explain or forget. And in that process, the idea of recovery became something deeply human, something that required patience, effort, and a willingness to move forward even when the path was not clear. Cities like Hiroshima and Nagasaki stood as powerful reminders of what had happened, not only because of the physical damage that remained, but because of the emotional weight they carried. And as time passed, those cities would slowly begin to transform, not by erasing the past, but by building something new alongside it, something that acknowledged what had been lost, while also creating space for life to return. In the early stages of rebuilding, resources were limited, and the challenges were many, because infrastructure had been damaged, industries had been disrupted, and the systems that supported daily life had been weakened. Yet even within those limitations, there was a growing sense that change was possible, that the future did not have to be defined only by what had been lost, but could also be shaped by what people chose to create next. Communities began to come together, not in large, dramatic ways, but in small, steady efforts that slowly added up, as people repaired homes, cleared debris, shared resources, and supported one another in ways that reflected a deep understanding that recovery was not something that could be done alone, but something that required collective effort, shared responsibility, and a belief that even the smallest actions could contribute to something larger. At the same time, the nation itself began to shift in its direction, because the experience of the war and its ending had created an opportunity for change, for rethinking priorities, for building systems that focused on stability, growth, and cooperation rather than conflict. And in that shift, Japan began to redefine its identity, not as a nation shaped by war, but as one that could be shaped by progress and resilience. Education became an important part of this transformation, because rebuilding a nation is not only about physical structures, it is about preparing future generations to think differently, to understand the world in new ways, and to carry forward lessons that had been learned through difficult experiences. And as schools reopened and learning resumed, there was a sense that the future would be shaped not only by what people built, but by what they taught and how they thought. Industry also began to recover, slowly at first, then with increasing momentum, as new approaches were developed, new methods were adopted, and a focus on quality, efficiency, and innovation began to take shape, allowing Japan to move forward in ways that would eventually lead to growth and development that few could have imagined in the immediate aftermath of the war. The process was not quick, And it was not without challenges, because rebuilding requires time, and progress often comes in small steps rather than sudden changes. Yet over the years, those small steps began to create a larger movement, one that carried Japan from a period of recovery into a period of growth, where the efforts of individuals and communities began to reflect in the strength of the nation as a whole. Hiroshima itself became a symbol of this transformation, not only as a reminder of what had happened, but as a place that represented peace, resilience, and the possibility of moving forward. And as the city rebuilt, it did so with an awareness of its history, choosing not to forget, but to remember in a way that could guide the future rather than hold it back. For the people who had lived through the events of 1945, the journey of rebuilding was deeply personal, because it involved not only creating new structures, but also finding ways to carry memories, to live with experiences that could not be changed, and to continue building lives that held meaning even after everything they had known had been altered. Families that had been separated or affected by the war began to rebuild their connections, creating new routines, new traditions, and new ways of living that reflected both the past and the present. And in those efforts, there was a quiet strength, a determination that did not always appear dramatic, but was steady and enduring, showing that recovery is not always visible in large actions, but often exists in daily life, in the decision to continue, to work, to care, and to hope. As the years passed, the changes in Japan became more visible, not only within its own borders, but also in how the world saw the nation. Because the story of Japan was no longer only about war and destruction, it was also about rebuilding, innovation, and the ability to transform challenges into opportunities for growth. And in that sense, the nation began to create a new identity that was shaped by both its history and its future. The economic growth that followed became one of the most significant aspects of this transformation, as industries expanded, technology developed, and new opportunities emerged, allowing Japan to move into a position of strength and influence in the global landscape, not through conflict, but through development, cooperation, and a focus on progress. But even as this growth continued, the memory of what had happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki remained an important part of the national consciousness, serving as a reminder of the past and a guide for the future, encouraging a commitment to peace and a recognition of the importance of preventing such events from happening again. This balance between remembering and moving forward became a defining feature of Japan's journey, because it allowed the nation to honor its history while also building something new, creating a path that did not ignore the past, but used it as a foundation for a different kind of future. And, as this new future continued to take shape, the idea of survival began to evolve, no longer limited to the immediate aftermath of destruction, but expanding into something broader, something that included growth, learning, and the ability to adapt to change in ways that created strength rather than weakness. Because survival, in its deepest form, is not only about continuing to exist after a difficult moment, it is about what is built afterward, about the choices that are made, about the direction that is taken, and about the willingness to move forward even when the past remains present. For Japan, this journey from destruction to rebuilding, from loss to growth, became one of the most powerful examples of resilience in modern history, not because it was easy, but because it required a sustained effort over time, a commitment to change, and a belief that even the most difficult experiences could lead to something meaningful if approached with determination and purpose. And, as the nation continued to grow, to develop, and to shape its place in the world, one truth became increasingly clear, not only to those within Japan, but to those observing from outside, that even after one of the most devastating moments in history, a nation can rise again, stronger, wiser, and more aware of what truly matters. Stronger, wiser, and more aware of what truly matters. But even as Japan rose again, even as its cities were rebuilt, its industries restored, and its place in the world redefined, there was something that could never be fully rebuilt or replaced, something that remained quietly present beneath the surface of progress, shaping thoughts, guiding decisions, and reminding both the nation and the world of a moment in history that had changed everything in a way that could not be undone. Because the story of Hiroshima and Nagasaki did not end when the war ended, and it did not disappear as the cities were rebuilt. Instead, it became something deeper, something that moved beyond physical destruction and entered the realm of memory, identity, and human understanding, becoming a permanent part of how people thought about power, responsibility, and the future of humanity. For the survivors, often called those who lived through that moment, the experience was not something that could be left behind, because memory does not rebuild itself the way cities do. It remains, it returns, it shapes how a person sees the world. And for many, the events of that day became a part of their lives in a way that could not be separated, influencing their thoughts, their feelings, and the way they understood both the past and the future. These individuals carried stories that were not just about what they saw, but about what they felt, about the confusion, the fear, the loss, and also the moments of humanity that existed even in the middle of destruction. And, as time passed, many chose to share those stories, not to reopen wounds, but to ensure that what had happened would not be forgotten, and more importantly, would not be repeated. The act of remembering became an important part of the legacy, because history that is not remembered can be misunderstood, and events that are not understood can be repeated. And in that sense, Hiroshima and Nagasaki became more than places. They became symbols, reminders of what is possible when power is used without full awareness of its consequences, and reminders of the responsibility that comes with knowledge and capability. Around the world, the events of 1945 began to influence how nations thought about weapons, conflict, and the future, because for the first time, humanity had seen the true potential of a weapon that could destroy an entire city in a single moment. And that realization brought with it a new kind of awareness, one that would shape international discussions, agreements, and efforts to control and limit the use of such power. At the same time, the story of Japan's recovery began to inspire others, not because of the destruction itself, but because of what followed. Because the ability of a nation to rebuild, to grow, and to transform after such a moment became a powerful example of resilience, showing that even in the face of extreme hardship, there is still the possibility of change, of progress, and of creating a future that is different from the past. Within Japan, the memory of Hiroshima and Nagasaki became part of the national identity, not as something that defined the nation in a negative way, but as something that contributed to a deeper understanding of peace, responsibility, and the importance of choosing paths that avoid repeating the mistakes of the past. And in that sense, the legacy of the blast became not only a reminder of destruction, but also a guide toward a more thoughtful and careful approach to the future. Cities like Hiroshima embraced this role by becoming places of remembrance and reflection, where people from around the world could come, learn, and understand what had happened, not through numbers or statistics, but through stories, through experiences, and through the quiet presence of places that carry meaning beyond what can be easily explained. The passage of time did not remove the importance of these events. Instead, it added layers to their meaning, as new generations learned about what had happened, asked questions, and sought to understand how such a moment could take place. And in that process, the story continued, not as something fixed in the past, but as something that remained relevant in the present and important for the future. Technology continued to advance, nations continued to grow, and the world continued to change. But the memory of what had happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki remained a point of reflection, a moment in history that asked important questions about how power is used, how decisions are made, and how humanity chooses to move forward in a world where the potential for both creation and destruction exists side by side. For individuals, the story offers something deeply personal as well, because beyond the scale of nations and global impact, it is also about people, about how individuals respond to difficult moments, how they support one another, how they find strength when everything feels uncertain, and how they continue to move forward even when the path ahead is not clear. The idea of survival, which began as a response to immediate danger, evolved into something much larger, becoming a symbol of resilience, of the ability to endure, adapt, and grow. And in that sense, the story of Japan before and after the bomb becomes not only a historical account, but also a reflection on the human ability to face challenges and create meaning even in the most difficult circumstances. And as we look back at that moment in August 1945, as we follow the journey from an ordinary morning to a life-changing event, from destruction to rebuilding, from silence to growth, we begin to see the full shape of the story, not as a single event, but as a series of moments connected by human experience, each one contributing to a larger understanding of what it means to live, to lose, and to begin again. Because history is not only about what happens, it is about what we learn from what happens. And the story of Japan, before and after the bomb, offers one of the most powerful lessons in modern history, not only about the consequences of decisions, but about the strength of people, the importance of memory, and the possibility of transformation even after the most difficult moments. As the years continue to pass, as the world continues to move forward, this story remains, not as something distant or forgotten, but as something that continues to speak, quietly but clearly, to anyone willing to listen. A reminder of what was lost, a reflection on what was learned, and a message about what can still be built. Because even after everything that happened, even after the light, the destruction, the silence, and the long journey that followed, the story does not end in darkness. It ends in understanding. It ends in resilience. And, most importantly, it ends in the choice to move forward. And now, when you look back at this story, it no longer feels like just history. It feels like a reminder of how quickly everything can change, a reminder of how powerful human decisions can be, and, most importantly, a reminder of how strong the human spirit truly is. Because Japan was not just destroyed, it was tested in a way that no nation had ever been tested before. And yet, it did not disappear. It did not stay in darkness. It rose again, step by step, day by day, from silence to strength, from ashes to a future no one could have imagined in those moments of destruction. And maybe that is the most important part of this story. Not just what was lost, but what was rebuilt. Not just the pain, but the courage that came after it. Because in the end, history is not only about what happens to us, it is about what we choose to become after it. And Japan chose to rise. Now, I want to ask you something. When you hear this story, what do you feel? And from which country are you watching this video? And what time is it right now in your city?